When Cataclysm first got announced, the hype was absolutely insane. Especially coming off the success of Wrath, just listen to the crowd's reaction during the BlizzCon announcement. Everything about Cataclysm seemed really awesome at the time. There was a new world, new quests, and a new massive dragon as the big baddie villain at the end. The momentum of World of Warcraft was at an all-time high, and around this time, it seemed like Blizzard couldn't miss even if they tried. Yet, in the eyes of a large portion of the community, Cataclysm really isn't looked back upon super fondly. The only other expansion pre-BFA in Shadowlands with a more negative reception is WoD, which to this day still kinda shocks me. Obviously, Cata isn't a perfect expansion. We know all about the last patch, which featured one of the most infamous raids of all time in Dragon Soul, and one of World of Warcraft's most controversial features of all time in the looking for raid system. I strongly believe that Cataclysm is, in hindsight, one of World of Warcraft's best expansions post-Wrath. But today, I'm here to tell you why Cataclysm Classic is worth visiting if you've never played it, or were one of the many people back in the day to stop playing it for a variety of reasons. The year is 2010, a relatively quiet year for the world in comparison to what we see today. With events like the Haiti earthquakes, Inception being the biggest movie of the year, and One Direction's formation being the headlining events. In the world of Warcraft, though, this year was anything but quiet. After the success that was Wrath of the Lich King, living up to the wild expectations of the existing, dedicated, and insanely loyal fanbase was always going to be a monumental task. Before games like Fortnite, World of Warcraft was truly an era-defining game in terms of mixing pop culture and the gaming space. South Park doing an entire episode based on WoW encapsulates how massive and hyped things were around this time. But the problem developing a game like World of Warcraft is almost always going to be the community reception to new ideas and changes. In Cataclysm, Blizzard took a lot of risks that, depending on who you are, were either fantastic and long overdue, or horrible and a massive departure from what made the game great to begin with. Take flying mounts, for example. Up to this point, we were contained in only being able to fly in expansion-specific zones like Outland or Northrend. But in Cataclysm, the entire world was the expansion-specific zone. You've got one part of the community who is ecstatic to finally be able to fly around Stormwind, and an entirely different part of the community who believes this trivializes and minimizes the amazing world we've grown to love. And this is just one example of how Cataclysm set the stage for the future of WoW in terms of community reception and player-based retention. But I believe that what Cataclysm did, although failing in some aspects, succeeded in the long term and set the stage for the expansion right after it, Mists of Pandaria. So without further ado, let's get back to the things that make Cataclysm, in my opinion, amazing and absolutely worth your time. I'm going to focus on gameplay first here, because no matter how you feel about the lore, the features, the content, etc., the gameplay is almost always king. It's the system that you interact with the most in any game, and Cataclysm absolutely nailed the gameplay and would further be refined to near perfection in Mists of Pandaria. So gameplay-wise, Cataclysm is much closer to Wrath than what it is to what we have in retail today. Going into your first heroic dungeon, your fundamentals still matter even if the gameplay speed has increased. CC, holding threat, and core mechanics of the boss fights are imperative to success. Classes are a bit more homogenized across the board, with a lot of them becoming builder-spender. For example, Ret Paladins have Holy Power now as a resource that you build with some abilities and you spend it with other abilities. This isn't exactly a new concept coming off the original Big 3 expansions that came before, but it helped to prop up some specs that were previously a bit wonky and unintuitive to play. Melee characters are less reliant on auto attack damage and swing timers in favor of actual abilities, while casters get way more quality of life changes. For example, Warlocks get Demonic Circle to finally get a bit more mobility, and Shadow Priests and Warlock Dots now fully benefit from haste and crit. These changes are a great middle ground between the old and the new. As great as the Big 3 expansions were, as WoW grew in popularity, things would have to speed up eventually to keep things fresh and capture a new audience. The general gameplay in Cata is still a far cry from the machine gun style that is current retail, and it's a lot closer to what we already knew from Burning Crusade and Wrath. Now, the talent system is a little bit controversial, as it was entirely redone from the tried and true system of the original game. Each spec now has specific abilities tied to them, meaning you can no longer use every ability the class has regardless of spec. You now select these specs at level 10, which means that a Frost Mage can have their Water Elemental as soon as level 10, and Sub-Rogues get Shadow Step. Once you pick the spec, you can't allocate points into the other trees until you've reached the end of the tree you pick, which means this takes away customization options that had previously been there. On the surface, this seems bad, until you realize that the current player base of WoW metaslave everything. In Wrath and SOD right now, people aren't mix and matching, and since Classic was released in 2019, the player base has simply Googled the absolute best spec because it's already figured out. I would argue that the lack of possible variety being gone from talent trees in Cata has absolutely zero impact on anyone's customization options, and only benefits the current player base further by enhancing the spec they choose to play. A lot of classes with multiple DPS roles have more than one viable spec. For example, Fire Mages and Arcane Mages are both great specs. With the talent system being the way it is, yes, you're going to be playing a cookie cutter build, but your class fantasy, depending on the spec you choose, has also been increased heavily. Most specs in Wrath have to get to the bottom of the tree anyway, so I only see this as a positive in terms of cutting or combining underutilized talents and abilities out in favor of streamlining things a little bit more. So generally, in terms of raw gameplay, no matter what you pick, I believe you will have fun with it. And as this is literally just a video game, fun is the only thing that matters at the end of the day. So let's talk about the old world versus the new world. And I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. This conversation is super subjective, but I'll give you my 2 cents on how the modern day player base might take the change versus how the player base took it in 2010. The original Azeroth questing is nostalgic and iconic, and revisiting it over the past few years has been amazing. My childhood truly came alive again, and I do think that there's a certain magic that the old world has that the new one just doesn't have. The rudimentary nature of it is charming, and the RPG aspect of actually having to read quest text to figure out where you're supposed to go and to give you clues pointing you in the right direction is awesome. But let's be realistic. 99% of you installed Questy and blew through everything on all of your characters as fast as possible without reading anything. Or you sat in dungeons all the way until max level because it was the most efficient way to do it. Cataclysm leveling was a natural progression of storytelling improvement and mechanics that previously existed in Wrath becoming more prominent. The process becomes smarter and more streamlined in the sense that you're directed towards your next goal more, and you're not walking halfway across the world to get to your objective. It keeps you engaged throughout the process and refines on the vehicle mechanic that started to become more prominent towards the end of Wrath and introduces mini instance events to guide the story while also providing you a big chunk of XP while you're in it. This is a concept that carried over into retail even today, but retail questing is essentially non-existent and can be done in a day or two. In Cata, the process is more streamlined, but you're still going to grind out the levels and interact and understand the progression of your class and spec over the course of the leveling experience. There's a strong sense of progression without things becoming monotonous and a huge slog like vanilla leveling felt after doing it for the first few times. I think that this fits a more modern audience as well, while still giving your character time to breathe and flesh out to the point where you truly understand the playstyle before you reach endgame. The zones are also really well designed, with notable standouts for me being Highjaw and Twilight Highlands. It's also pretty clear that these zones were made with flying in mind, with a lot of verticality being introduced into the old world. Before I get into raiding and PvP, I want to talk about 3 systems you're going to be interacting with a lot during your time playing Cata that I think are important, but also, and more importantly, very well done. The first is the reputation grind of Cata. Out of all of the reputation grinds I've done in World of Warcraft throughout the years, I feel like Cataclysm was not only the least stressful to get exalted, but one of the only ones I've done on multiple characters. Every new location has its own reputation tied to them, with the later patches introducing even more reputations like Avengers of Hyjal for the Firelands patch in 4.2. Each quest you do for each zone awards rep for those zone-specific factions, so it incentivizes you to do every quest in each zone for that extra bit of boost. On top of that, there's dailies for each zone that really aren't terrible and generally take a few minutes each to complete, and there's also a tabard from each faction that gives you rep while you're in Cata dungeons. So if you want to target farm a specific faction for one of the rewards, it's super easy to do that. Every single class will have at least one or two factions that you'll want to get exalted with, because early on in Cata, some of these items are super powerful and will carry you through the first phase if you're struggling with gear. And even if you don't need the gear, there's also profession-specific crafts that are very sought after and powerful throughout the expansion. The second system of note is Reforging, which was cut off immediately after Cataclysm ended. Compared to some of the more convoluted systems we've seen in retail recently, Reforging really strikes a balance of being simple and intuitive, but also giving your gear an extra level of customization and options. How it works is you can take off a percent of a certain stat on a piece of gear that you get and roll it off into a different stat that's better for you and your spec. Let's say you stumble on a piece of blue armor in a dungeon and you're in full greens, but it has dodge and parry on it and you're a Frost Death Knight. It has more strength on it, which makes it a DPS upgrade due to how stat weights function in Cata, but you don't need the dodge or parry. Take a portion of it off, put haste or crit on it instead, and you have a solid filler item until you get a true upgrade. I always found that as I was getting better pieces of gear on the way to BIS, this was always such a clutch system to keep my character performing optimally while still getting upgrades to trigger that dopamine. The problem that the system had was once you get those BIS items, Reforging becomes a practice of mathematical optimization that ultimately cuts out any real user variation. Even in 2010, we were using programs like Ask Mr. Robot to tell us how to reforge optimally, and the modern player base is, of course, going to play as optimally as possible, so by the time most of you reach the pinnacle of gear, reforging is just going to be reduced down to, this is what you do, and then you don't touch it again, which is why it was eventually cut. But I do think the system had a lot more potential and was cut too soon, and I'm glad it's coming back because you do use it quite a bit, and there is a lot of user variation you can play around with before you get to the BIS gear. And then the last system is, of course, transmog. Anyone who thinks transmog ruined the game, hurt the game, or really anything negative at all about it is smoking something fierce. It is and should be universally praised, and we've seen so many games since it come out and adopt a transmog system of their own. Customization is a part of the fantasy of a game like this, and it's given all players the ability to be creative and show off the different combinations they can do to make themselves stand out. There's really not much to say about it. It's a total W for Cataclysm and WoW in general, and was so ahead of its time compared to how many games implement it to this day. Okay, so now let's get to the good stuff. For this, I'll separate things into dungeons, raiding, and PvP and talk about them separately, because this is going to be a make or break for a lot of people in any expansion. I want to preface this by saying that Cataclysm has an insane amount of content in it. Even compared to what we have in retail in 2024, the sheer amount of content they added at the beginning and middle of Cata was truly amazing and a little bit overwhelming. That being said, I'm not going to be able to cover it all here, or this video would be hours long, but just so you're aware, you're not going to be content starved in Cata in any way. So let's go over dungeons. In Cataclysm, they're either the greatest implementation of dungeons in any version of WoW ever, or one of the worst, depending on who you're asking. To start, the Looking for Group Dungeon Finder was in full swing at this point, and it will be in Cataclassic as well, so there's some things to understand about it. There's an item level requirement for each tier of dungeon: normal, heroic, and later in the expansion, Hour of Twilight heroics. It's a pretty streamlined system. You quest to get gear for normals, and then you run normals and buy BOEs for heroics, or you game the system entirely with PvP gear, which is relatively easy to get. The pre-nerf heroics in Cataclysm are exactly like you've heard or you remember, extremely punishing with enemies hitting hard and mechanics one-shotting you at a moment's notice. It's really no wonder the dungeons ended up getting nerfed, because they were the definition of heroic compared to their normal counterparts. Getting reputation gear and profession gear was critical to their completion, and a lot of the times, people would gear check each other before even starting and instantly leave if they felt like their group wasn't up to the task. Personally, I love Cataclysm dungeons and their difficulty for the most part, with a few exceptions like Throne of the Tides, even if the last boss fight in that dungeon was pretty epic. And that's a common theme you'll find with Cata dungeons in how epic in nature they all are, to the point where they almost feel like mini raids. Grim Batal, Halls of Origination, the Vortex Pinnacle are all epic in scale and in terms of bosses you fight, really making you feel like you're taking out really big enemies imperative to your journey throughout the expansion. And they also added dungeons throughout the expansion, including a revamped ZA and ZG that were truly epic in scale and quality as well. And later on, we even had more dungeons like Well of Eternity and End Time, which served as a bit of a catch-up gear mechanic to enter in the later raids. Overall, I think that the modern player base is much better equipped for the challenge of Cata dungeons, and they feel rewarding in so many ways that there's something for everyone in doing them. After that, we have raiding, which is a bit of a different story. Dragon Soul and Looking for Raid really left a sour taste in the perception of Cata raiding amongst the community. And for good reason. Looking for Raid was truly one of the worst decisions in WoW's history, forcing players to go through a raiding experience with zero communication, zero sense of community, and zero sense of progression just to get weaker versions of gear so they could more easily do the actual versions of the raid in normal and heroic. I think it's pretty obvious that LFR won't be returning for Classic, so let's focus on the raids without that mechanic in mind, starting with the first 3 raids. At the start, we had 3 raids: Bastion of Twilight, Throne of the Four Winds, and Blackwing Descent. And in total, you had 12 bosses across 2 difficulties spread out amongst 3 raids to do once a week. This is a stark contrast from the start of Wrath, where you had a rehashed version of Nax and 2 raids with 1 boss each. I think Blizzard really learned their lesson with that, and the subscriber numbers from the launch of Cata were really at an all-time high because of how much there was to do. You're going to find that the difficulty of the first tier of raids is fairly easy in general, with a bit of challenge sprinkled in. And I'm not going to sugarcoat anything here. These raids are utterly fantastic in every sense, from the design to just the sheer amount of fun they were to do. There's even true variations of raids depending on difficulty. Like in Bastion of Twilight, when you finally defeat Cho'Gall in Heroic, you're greeted with the nice reward of a completely new boss that wasn't there on normal. There's also the PvP/PvE raid, Buried and Hold, that can be completed if your faction controls Tol Barad, similar to VOA and Wrath. Then of course, there's patch 4.2 where we got Firelands, which is undoubtedly one of the best raids and patches in WoW's history. If you've never experienced patch 4.2, I truly believe that Cataclysm is worth your time based on that alone. The layout of Firelands was perfect, not being too long or too short, with interesting and different boss mechanics like we haven't really seen before or since. A boss like Alice Razor was truly insane, disguising itself at first as an ad cleave fight, except for the fact that your raid members can collect feathers on the ground to literally fly up into the air to damage the boss while she's flying. And at the end, you get to fight a revamped Ragnaros, who has a completely different mechanic on the heroic version, where this dude literally grows legs and comes out of the lava to beat your raid into submission. The sheer scale and wonder of this was amazing at the time, and there's no question that this will be a highly anticipated and fan favorite raid once more in Cataclassic. And then of course, there's Dragon Soul, and I won't sugarcoat this, the raid has a lot of problems. The first half of the raid really isn't too bad, and the bosses have some unique mechanics such as Yorsage with the little globals that he spawns. So the raid is average for the most part, until you get to Deathwing Spine, which is one of the worst boss fights I've ever seen. It's got you fighting the various mechanics that spawn on top of Deathwing himself, while soaring through the air and making sure not to make him do a roll and wipe your raid completely. Visually, the fight is unique and interesting, but mechanically and functionally, it's pretty awful, and only serves as a precursor to the actual fight, Madness of Deathwing. This fight is, again, very visually and conceptually interesting, but functionally, it's truly a mess with your raid being so split across the different platforms that it really just wasn't fun. I believe that if Cataclysm Classic has a sharp decline in the player base, it's going to come in patch 4.3 when this raid releases. This is kind of a stark contrast from Wrath, where everyone was anticipating killing the Lich King the entire time, and that feeling when you finally did it really felt like a perfect wrap up to that expansion. But besides that, raiding in Cata is S tier, and I think that you're going to have a great time doing it up until the last patch. I don't have a ton to comment on with the PvP, as I was and still am primarily a PvE player. But I did do most of my PvPing in Cataclysm and Mists of Pandaria. For starters, there's the introduction of RBGs and much more of an emphasis on battlegrounds in general. There's also two new battlegrounds, with Battle for Gilneas and Twin Peaks. And on top of that, the honor system has been completely reworked, and there's now honor and conquest points. Honor points being used for lower tier PvP gear and earned pretty generously, and conquest points being earned through arenas and RBGs for much better rewards. One thing that you need to know is a lot of people chose to gear their characters and alts through PvP to get the item level requirement for the dungeons, and I'm sure you're going to see the exact same thing in Classic. With RBGs, you have the opportunity to get the rank titles from vanilla as well, so there's something big to strive for with those. I have fond memories of PvPing in Cata, and I think that there's something for everyone with the systems they have in place, from the casuals to the super sweaties and everything in between. The funny thing about everything I've said so far is that I feel like I haven't even scratched the surface of Cataclysm in general. The general perception of this expansion is so misguided in my opinion. As MMOs progress, content will always be king, especially interesting and fun content. The content in Cataclysm was some of the best we've ever gotten, and one bad patch during the expansion shouldn't define it. Look at the first patch for Wrath, which is regarded as one of, if not the best expansions the game has ever seen. It was a complete mess with little to no content and a rehashed raid. It got better, sure, but when we talk about how great Wrath was, we don't define it by its first patch. But I understand. Deathwing was the big baddie of Cataclysm, and everything we did was leading up to that. And when it finally came, it was a disappointment. But for me, that doesn't change how much fun Cataclysm was. And there's so much content that instead of getting bored of it, you might literally just get burnt out with how much there is to do. That's either a good or a bad thing depending on who you are, but hopefully Blizzard will pace things properly. The Cataclysm Classic closed beta just came out, and if Wrath was any indication, we're looking at around May for a full release. If you had any doubts about whether or not you wanted to continue your Classic journey, I would strongly recommend you give it a try. Even if you played it on release and felt like you just didn't like it, I really think you should try it again with an open mind. I'll be there day one on my Frost Death Knight, because Machine Gun Obliterate is the most fun Death Knights have ever been for me, and I hope to see you all there as well. If you liked this video, consider tossing me a like and a subscription. I'm hoping to get to 100 subscribers soon, which might not sound like much, but for me it's already been a really fun journey to get this far. As always, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.